switch off my camera and share my screen with you. If you're not able to hear me or you're not able to see, please just let me know. Are you all able to see the presentation in front of you?
Yes, Carol.
Thank you. And you're able to hear clearly as well?
As well, yes, thank you.
Thank
Carol,
you.
just before we proceed,
Yes.
we'll be watching the chat as well. So how would you prefer question coming from the chat, you answering them during your presentation, or shall we leave it for afterwards?
I think we go to the end of the presentation, but as your questions pop up, please just type them in the chat because you may forget exactly what the content was that I was delivering and what you wanted to ask. So I think it's going to be easier if we post it in the chat and we just address any questions at the end of the presentation.
Okay, thank you, Carol.
Thank you. All right. So now, as you can see, the heading of this presentation this afternoon is when is copyright copy wrong? And I'm assuming that most of you will somewhere, either now or in the near future, be writing and researching a thesis. And this presentation is basically just going to give you a couple of guidelines. Unfortunately, copyright's not the most riveting topic to be discussing. And it's always somehow just been out there. But when you come to researching and writing a thesis, it suddenly starts to have and take on a new meaning for you. So don't be distressed or blown away by what you may hear this afternoon and think, oh my word, I've been infringing. That's not the point. The point here is to make you aware of it and how you can actually utilize material correctly going forward. So now, as you heard, I head up the Copyright, Trademark and Short Courses Division, which forms part of INOFIS, which is our intellectual property and our industry interactive company within the university. So our new name is basically no longer INOFIS. It's now Innovation and Commercialization. That's a new divisional name that we've been allocated during this whole brand refresh process that the university's been going through. I have had quite a lot of exposure to copyright over the past few years, and especially in an academic environment. And there's a lot of, I would almost say, misconceptions regarding commercial use and academic use of copyrighted material. So hopefully this presentation will give you a little bit more clarity as you move forward. So I'm going to start by just quickly touching on what is copyright. So copyright is an intellectual property right. It is like a trademark or a patent or an industrial design right. It has got an economic and a moral function. So it is attached to anything that you have created or any intellectual property that you have created. It grants you as the author of a work a number of exclusive rights. And these rights either allow you or prevent you from letting others use your work or exploiting your work without your permission. Noticeable or noteworthy is that copyright exists on all original literary, dramatic, musical, and artistic works of authorship. Now, this is the next point regarding our Copyright Act 98 of 1978 in South Africa. This is the piece of legislation that regulates our copyright matters. However, 1978, as you can see, is seriously outdated. It was amended sort of in the late 1990s, early 2000s. However, it has not kept abreast with the technological advances that we have made as a society. So our government set about in 2015 revising the Copyright Act and drafting what they now call the Copyright Amendment Bill, and which we just refer to as CAB, C-A-B. Unfortunately, it is a very seriously contentious piece of legislation. It was slated from the moment it was made public and not just from academic institutions, but from your blind societies, from your publishers, from your publishing societies. So as you can see, and I'd also say from legal perspectives as well, in 2017, they finally made this piece of legislation available for public comment and parliamentary public hearings. And it was passed into Parliament through the National Assembly and National Council during the course sort of at the end of 2017, beginning of 2018. However, straight after that, we went into a lockdown in 2020, and obviously there wasn't getting priority on our president's desk. So in May 2021, the whole process was reinitiated, but however, this bill was referred back by the president. So it went back to the Portfolio Committee of the Trade and Industry Department for further public comment and parliamentary public hearings. Throughout this process, Stellenbosch University has been providing comment. We have been providing input, not just from our office, but from our chair for intellectual property at the institution. So unfortunately, we are still back at the drawing board. More recently, as in of yesterday, there was a further portfolio committee meeting of the Department of Trade and Industry, voicing opinions on proposed amendments that they want to make to specifically 5 provisions within this piece of legislation. But to date, we have no outcome. So unfortunately, the current Copyright Act, that is 98 of 1978 with amendments, is what is applicable in our environment. Now you're going to wonder, why is this word copyright so important to you while you are in the process of researching or writing your thesis? So let's look at it. A, you've got a thing called copyright infringement. So there's an infringement risk. A, that you could be using someone else's work and exposing yourself to infringement. Your second point is that it protects the value of your academic or your work or research work. So you've got an infringement aspect, you've got a protection aspect with regards to copyright. Your next factor is that copyright is automatic. There's no registration, as with patents or trademarks, to be able to obtain copyright protection. It subsists automatically on works that you have created, as long as your work is original, is in a material or tangible format. So in other words, there is no copyright that can subsist in an idea. It has to be noted down somewhere in a material format. Another important factor of copyright is that it fosters intellectual creativity, which is especially important in an academic environment. And it is often used by your creativity. It's used as an incentive to gain academic recognition. Another important factor that as a student, you're assigned copyright in all your works, including your research conducted as part of your studies. Your papers, your thesis and dissertations are assigned to Stellenbosch University on registration. The same as with a staff member of Stellenbosch University. Anything created in the course and scope of that staff member's employment at the institution belongs to the institution. Another important factor of copyright is that publishing, this thesis or piece of research that you're creating, you're going to want to share. So it has the potential to be distributed and to reach a much wider commercial platform, not only academically, but also commercially. So we caution you, because publishers are normally wanting you to grant or assign your copyright to them, and they want the electronic rights in your work. So we advise you, be careful of being exclusive to one publisher, because it's inhibiting on your research. So let's quickly just touch on ownership of copyright, because I mentioned on the previous slide that as a student or staff member, Stellenbosch owns the work that you have created. So according to legislation, the owner of a copyrighted work is the original creator of the work. But onto this ownership, we will have exceptions, as we've just stated, assignment. So as a student, you've assigned it, so that's an exception. As an employer of a staff member at Stellenbosch University, there's been assignment by employment. So another exception is commissioning. So in other words, if I'm an artist and you come along and you pay me to create a portrait of you, I own the original work. But by commissioning me to do the work, I've assigned my copyright in that work to you as the person who I painted. Then we have state-controlled, which was particularly prominent now during the pandemic, where there's a lot of research ongoing for COVID-19 factors and vaccinations. So if we have I'd almost say an instruction from government to create a white paper, yellow paper, whatever paper they need us to create with regards to a specific condition within the country, it becomes state-controlled. So then nobody owns the work except the government. So at Stellenbosch University, the sole owner of all work of authorship created by its staff or students in the normal course and scope of their studies or employment belongs to SU. Another reason you've got to consider is that outside organizations provide bursaries and scholarships to SU students. And these scholarships do not necessarily cover the full cost of such studies or research. So students are not in a position to grant any intellectual property rights to any outside organizations. I'm taking, for example, if you have a bursary that has been provided, let's say by Capitec Bank, you do not have the right to grant rights to Capitec Bank to use any intellectual property that you've created. You will have to approach our office, and between ourselves and the Division for Research Development, we will assist you in negotiating the pitfalls around the intellectual property rights when there's a bursary or scholarship involved. Another important factor is that in copyright, in South Africa, copyright lasts for the duration of the life of the author plus another 50 years of the author. Thereafter, the work may fall into public domain. In other words, then you're able to free to use it without permission. However, just be careful because some of the works can fall into the estate. I'm thinking, for example, Walt Disney. His works are not going to come into the public domain. His estate will be managed by whichever authorities have been appointed to do so. So generally in South Africa, that is the duration of copyright in a work, 50 years, the life of the author plus 50 years. In the case of a co-authored article or book, it is the life of the author of the longest surviving author plus 50 years. 50 years is not the duration that's assigned worldwide. For example, in America, it's 70 years after the death of the author. So just be aware, especially when you're using international works, whether they actually do fall into public domain or not. So now we're going to look, you're now busy researching your thesis, and obviously you are going to be using third-party content. Now, by third-party content, we mean content that was not created by yourselves. So it's somebody else created this content. And now this is where it becomes this absolute sea of jargon of public domain, Creative Commons, fair use, open access, open source. So we're going to try and unpack a few things just to give you a couple of pointers as to what you should be looking out for when using content. So let's look at the copyright perspectives on third-party content when you're researching and writing. Always just go back to the drawing board, and here the basic copyright principles apply. You are going to need permission if you are wanting to put third-party content in your thesis for the following that you've got to consider. You're going to be reproducing, publishing, or communicating articles on your research or your thesis in a material form. It's going to be in a printed format, or it's going to be electronically, let's say, for example, on Sun Scholar. So be cautious, because if you're putting this graph or an image into your thesis that is not one that you've created, it's not just for your own use at that stage. At this stage now, there's the potential to go far further, reproduce, publish, communicate. Those are all indications your thesis or your article's going further. So you're going to need permission as well if you take a whole or complete text. If you take a whole journal article or a whole chapter out of a book, and you use this or you summarize it, you've created a new work of an original work. So this could be from an article, book, or paper, or an internet material. Be careful when summarizing, because you've created a new work and it's not, you've based it on somebody else's work. So we advise you. The trick here is the wording whole or complete text. And I'll deal with that on the next slide as to how much you're allowed to do. Using a substantial part of copyright material. So in other words, if I take quite a substantial part of a journal article and I take it as is, verbatim, and put it into my thesis. This becomes tricky here because the legislation doesn't indicate what is meant by substantial part. So there's no fixed percentage allocated to substantial. Not only is it quantity, in other words, 6 pages or 1 paragraph, but it's quality as well. So if it's the relevant part or crux of somebody else's original research, it could be considered to be a substantial part, even though it could only be a page. So the crux or the essence of the work is the important part here. So it's not just quantity, it's quality as well, attributes to substantial part. Another important factor is complete works, artistic works, diagrams, maps, graphs, photographs. You are not going to only be putting a portion of a photograph or a diagram or a map or a graph in your work. You're going to be putting that whole work to just, let's say, to demonstrate a point that you're trying to convey. Permission is required when you are doing so if you did not take the photograph, create the diagram, draw the map or graph yourself. So now it just sounds like you need permission for just about everything you're doing. However, there are instances where permission is not required. So in other words, this is where we go back to that complete or whole text on the previous slide. If you paraphrase or write a small part of the original source in your own words, and you correctly reference the original source, you will not need permission. Again, here we refer to insubstantial part of the copyright material. And this is the tricky one because we are not all qualified to determine if something is substantial or insubstantial. But again, if you are using a very, very small part of copyright material, reference the original author and source correctly. You are able to quote a small part of copyright material, but use quotation marks and correct referencing of the source and author. It's very important because the minute you don't put quotation marks in, it looks like it is your own work, and then you could be accused of plagiarism as passing it off as your own. You are able to cite a source in your text, but here again, be careful. If you're citing a source in your text and your results or your conclusions of your research are in complete antithesis to what was conveyed to the source that you were using, you can stipulate that you are not in agreement, that your results reflect differently, but there's a way of citing a source correctly without putting them in a negative light. So you can source them in that you're in disagreement, but don't necessarily place them in a negative light. You are able to use an individual random piece of data, a fact. For example, I don't almost say irrelevant to examples, but a recipe book. A recipe cannot enjoy copyright protection. You don't need permission to use a recipe. But the format in which it appears inside the recipe book, that is protected by copyright. Simply because if I've got a recipe and you note down the recipe and somebody's used a half a teaspoon of salt and somebody else is using a quarter teaspoon of salt. So it's almost a random piece of information. Another fact is, in the old days, your telephone books couldn't enjoy copyright protection. It was a random piece of information or fact or data. Permission is not required for open access sources that you are using, but it's very important here that you must check the licensing provisions under which the material was made available under open access. And I'll touch on Creative Commons licenses, which is the CC I've referred to on this slide. There are various types of Creative Commons licensing, some more lenient, some more restrictive, but we'll address that a little bit further on. So now we're getting to these images where we have free of copyright, where we have royalty free, we have all this jargon, where we go in onto these websites and we suddenly see, oh, I can download this image, but I've got a bit of a watermark in the background on it. All these sort of things are indicative that it's enjoying copyright protection. Also, if you're downloading an image and it very clearly stipulates this image may be subject to copyright restrictions, it is more than likely. The chances of it not being, the fact that they've stipulated, there's a pretty good chance that it is subject to copyright restrictions. I've mentioned a few copyright-free websites here that you're able to access, but be very careful because they've got two options. They either have copyright-free images that you're free to use and utilize in whichever way, or they have royalty-free, and there's a vast difference. Free of copyright means that there's no copyright restrictions on it, you're free to use it. Royalty-free, however, means that you have purchased the license of this image and then you can apply it in whichever way that license dictates to you. So be very careful when an image is royalty-free, it doesn't mean it's free of copyright. I've also shown you some highlighted areas where it indicates when you click on those images, it gives you the type of license. It gives you what you are permitted to do, what you're not permitted to do. It indicates whether it's for commercial or non-commercial purposes. It indicates whether permission is required, whether attribution is required. Your Creative Commons licenses very clearly, the 6 licenses clearly stipulate no derivatives may be allowed. It's only for commercial use, non-commercial use. Attribution required. So check your licensing provisions. That's your starting point, because that will give you a clear indication of what you need to do or not need to do. Now, I'm pretty sure you've also heard of the word fair dealing, and in America, there's a term fair use. Now, America's fair use does not apply to the fair dealing clause in South Africa. The new CAB, Copyright Amendment Bill, is trying to address a fair use principle. We are obviously running into a few sticky situations with it, and it's obviously also delaying the bill currently. Currently, fair dealing is the provision that applies in South Africa. And it clearly stipulates in Section 12(1) of the Copyright Act that for purposes of research or private study, or personal or private use, a single copy of a reasonable portion of work consistent with fair dealing is allowed. So in other words, it's clearly indicating it must be for research or private study or personal or private use, only a single copy. In other words, you can't make 6 copies and give it to 6 other people. And it's referring to a reasonable portion. So we're back to the substantial and insubstantial part. Generally accepted that copying of a major portion of work is not reasonable, and it's not compatible with this provision in the current Copyright Act. I need you to note that this provision is not clearly defined in the Act. So it's a very gray area in the Act, and it's open to a lot of interpretation. Also note, you may be allowed to copy reasonable amounts of material for researching your writing, but it's very unlikely that this reasonable amount that you copied for your research purposes is going to extend to distribution, publication, communication. And that's ultimately what's going to happen to your thesis. It's going to go onto a Sun Scholar, it's going to go onto platforms, and it's going to be distributed. So fair dealing currently in the old Copyright Act does not cover this provision. Now, I'm just going to briefly touch on plagiarism and copyright infringement, because there seems to be sometimes a little bit of confusion as to what is one, what is the other. There's a very good sketch on Wikipedia that you're free to go and use, where it clearly shows you that plagiarism is a moral aspect. Copyright infringement has got a moral and a legal aspect. And in the middle, you sometimes do get plagiarism and copyright infringement overlapping. You can get infringement and plagiarism in one item. So when that happens, it means that you, A, passing it off as your own work, so you're not giving attribution to anybody, and B, you're taking it without permission. So that is that middle section. That's when it's present in the work that you're utilizing. So let's break it down further. What is plagiarism? Plagiarism is a violation of a moral right, and it's a violation of an academic standard. It's not a good academic standard or practice. Plagiarism involves verbal or written copying of the original. It also involves failure to attribute or acknowledge the original creator of the original material. And you're infringing the author's work, and you're infringing his reputation. So it's a moral right that you're infringing. Copyright infringement, on the other hand, you've got a legal violation, and it involves physical reproduction. In other words, downloading a file, PDF, putting it up on an electronic platform. It's a physical reproduction of the original. And you can print it, you can, in the old days, photostat it. So it's a physical, not just written or verbal. Your infringement is the failure to obtain permission And in certain instances, you may need to pay a copyright fee to obtain that material. So that is why it's becoming a legal violation. Because now you're not only infringing the author's work and reputation, his moral right, but if you don't have to pay for the material and you're not paying for it, you're infringing his economic right and you are potentially affecting his income as well. So those are the basic differences between your plagiarism and copyright infringement. Now I've given you the background of copyright and I've given you a few pointers. And now your next question is going to be, how do I get permission if there is something I want to use? It's quite a simple process, but it can become a lengthy process if you do not get responses when you are requesting permission. So let's have a look. So now we want to use third-party content, but the first and foremost, let's go and check the terms of use of material. This will be in the front of a book on an imprint page. It will be on a website under terms and conditions, sometimes on the bottom of the website page, otherwise in the top right-hand corner. Once you've determined whether you're allowed to use the material or not, then you can take your next steps. You're specifically looking for words saying to you, it's for non-commercial use, which is what you are doing when you're researching. But be careful, because you're potentially going to be publishing later, then you've got a commercial factor involved. You're also looking for words that saying free to use, attribution required. That's the sort of thing that you want to see. If it tells you that no further copies, reproduction in any format is allowed without prior written permission, A, of the author or the publisher or the website owner, then the process has to kick off where you require permission. If you've checked the terms of the material and see it's on open source or open access, your next step is check A, if it's in public domain, or B, what is the type of Creative Commons license under which this material was made available. And most open source and open access content will clearly indicate, they'll tell you license 4.0 BYCC ND, and it's saying by attribution for commercial or non-commercial use, no derivatives allowed. And if you click on that little license icon, it will tell you what you may or may not do. So check that with open source. Now that we've gone through checking the terms of use, we've gone through open source, and unfortunately the piece of material you want to use has now, permission is required. You've got to find out who owns this material. In some instances, authors assign copyright to a publisher. In some instances, even though the copyright was assigned, the book or the article is no longer in use or out of print, and the publisher has given the rights back to the author. So you'll even have to start finding out where the rights to your specific piece of material lies. Mainly in journals, the rights lie with the publisher. In books, it's a little more tricky because it could lie with the publisher or with the author. Now you've determined who owns the piece of work, you have to request permission in writing. Verbal permission for copyright permission does not carry any weight. It has to be in writing from the copyright owner, and he has to agree to it, and preferably indicated to you what you may or may not do with the content. I'd almost say refine and streamline your permission request process. Indicate that it's for non-commercial academic use, or indicate it's going to be used commercially later. Initially on, let's say, Sun Scholar, later it's going to go open to publication. Also indicate the format. Are you going to be printing it or make it electronically available by your academic repository, Sun Scholar? The bad thing is here that you won't necessarily receive a reply overnight. You're going to have to follow up continually until you do receive a reply. But there are going to be instances where you're not going to get a response. So what do you do? If you do not get a response to your attempts to obtain permission, we advise you to consider removing the content, because by putting it on an open platform, you're not only putting yourself now, but you're putting us at risk too of infringing. So the institution could be infringing too, especially if this work is appearing on platforms. The other reason why you may consider to remove it is if the publisher or the copyright owner asks you for payment of a copyright fee. Now, you've got to be careful here, because if it's international authors or international associations or institutions, you're looking at a dollar, pound, euro fee, or whatever the unit of currency is, and it's obviously not favoring South African currency at the moment. And over and above onto that, you're going to have to obviously pay an overseas draft rate through the South African Reserve Bank. So I would advise you, if you are I'd say charge the copyright fee for what you do. We normally try and advise you to negotiate. Tell them that it's for academic purposes. We give them a whole indication. And most times they do come back and waive the fee and I'll say in most cases, we do get the fee waived. If you're not able to waive your fee, we suggest that you consider removing the material. If it's a insubstantial or a reasonably small portion, we'd say paraphrase it in your own words, crediting your original source and author. Otherwise, reduce the extent so that it does form an insubstantial part and credit the original source or author. So now you get permission, you get a response to your inquiry. What may you do and not do with the material? You have to attribute the source. You have to indicate that it's not your own material. You also have to state if you've altered or modified the material from the original format, but this you can only do if you've been given permission to do so by the original copyright owner. And you must use the material in the manner for which permission has been granted. Don't think because you requested permission for print format that you're going to go and put it out on an electronic format if permission was granted for a print format. So you can only do that for which permission was granted. So that's why we advise you upfront, just request permission, I'll sort of say globally, for everything, because you're not sure what you're going to be doing 4 or 5 years down the line. The biggest factor is you may not alter or distort the original material in any way which would basically affect an author's moral right. The minute you put him in a negative light, you are opening yourself up to a complaint regarding defamation of his character. So the big thing is when you are altering material, not to distort it from the original material in a negative way. So now we're going to get to the stage where we have now finally gone through all the hoops for copyright permission. We've now got to the writing part of our thesis. We've now submitted our thesis. Our degree's been conferred. You're feeling on top of the world, and the next minute you get a email, or you get a message, or you get requested. They picked up published your work on a platform, and they would like you to publish. A few factors here when you come to publishing your work. Since right in the beginning, I indicated staff and students assigned to SU copywriting all their works. Be careful, you can't just go ahead and publish your work if it's been submitted as part of your degree. That copyright lies and vests in Stellenbosch University. Stellenbosch University's yearbook, part 1 under general, they give you provisions, read the format, when you are submitting and duplicating your thesis, as well as with regards to publication of your thesis, what process is required, whose permission do you need to do so before you go ahead and publish part of your thesis. You may not publish your assignments, your thesis, your dissertations, or actually any SU course content in any form other than an article in an accredited academic journal without prior written approval of the dean of the relevant faculty. Now, your articles in the accredited academic journal, those are managed by our Division for Research Development. If you go onto their website, you're going to see quite a comprehensive website indicating which are accredited and peer-reviewed publishers, what is the process, because they have to moderate basically research output as well. So you can do yourselves a favor and go and look on the Division for Research Development with regards to articles in academic journals when you come to that stage of wanting to publish there. Remember, if you're going to be publishing parts of your assignments, thesis, dissertations in a publication, a book, an e-book, or in a general book, income from anything that you're going to be published, we are not going to claim as an institution, but in the same breath, we are not going to be paying for your publication either. Any cost incurred for that publication, once we've given you permission to utilize the work, is for your own account. You're welcome to contact our office, the old office, Innovation and Commercialization, with regards to your intended publications before you proceed. If you're legally capable thereto, we will give you usage rights to use your content in whatever publication you're wanting to do. We will, however, just give you a few words of advice. We will tell you, because we are fully aware of predatory publishers out there, that you choose a specialized academic publisher with a high quality end product. Avoid mass vanity publishers. These people target you on Facebook, on Instagram, on Twitter. Be cautious. There's no peer review. There's no editorial process. They want exclusive distribution rights in print and electronic. And before you realize, you've also assigned your copyright to them. So we advise you must try and achieve a workable compromise between yourselves and your publisher and the institution, since we own the work that you've submitted to us. And then also just bear in mind that as a public research institution, we want as wide dissemination of our research as possible through our websites and through the research websites. So we caution you again about granting exclusive rights to your publisher, because it's going to be restrictive on your research. Just to give you a highlight here, we have for the last 4 years been monitoring various electronic platforms, open electronic platforms, and now more recently commercial tutoring services, where they are making use of SU course content, lecture slides, test examination papers, students' assignments, theses, and essays. They place these materials on these platforms and they distribute them for commercial gain under our banner and our trademark. So we are currently in the process of issuing letters of demand, takedown notices, cease and desist letters to all these website owners and service providers where they are infringing our current content. The scale of the infringing content that is currently available is substantial. It's more than 6,000 items on these various platforms and services. And this has a major negative impact on an academic and research institution like ourselves, where we have a very high academic and research standing. And there's also having to apply effective brand management in this regard, since some of the material that is still being made available there is about 7 or 8 years outdated. So it's sort of putting the spotlight on Stellenbosch University as creating subpar academic material. So you've been advised, and just caution, just so that you are aware of it. And on that note, I've come to the end of my presentation, and the copyright presentation will be available. I think Bruce, Marie, it will be made available to them so that you're able to access links. But you're also welcome to contact our office at any stage if you have any issues you would like to raise.
Thank you, Carol. Is there any questions? If there are any questions, you are welcome to unmute yourself.
It looks like I've scared everybody away.
It doesn't look like there is any other questions or any questions, Carol. Carol, thank you so much and well done to yet another excellent presentation. As always, the session was very informative and certainly relevant within our personal and as well as our professional environments. I'm sure going forward we will all copy right and not wrong.
Thank you for this opportunity as well. And as I say, you're welcome to contact our office. I do know some people are not very comfortable raising their infringement issues on a platform.
Yes,
so you're
yes.
more welcome to contact us. We're not there to criticize, we're there to assist and help.
Thank you so much. And that's it for today, everyone. Thank you for your attendance. Please know that the recording will be distributed, as soon as it's ready. And as well as any other, Carol, did you say that there's anything that you're gonna share with us for us to share with the group as well?
Yes, if you want my presentation, I'm happy to share the presentation with you.
Okay, thank you so much, Carol. You can then forward it either to me or to Marie, then we will further share it with the group. Thank you so much, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.